This is the Sideways Thinker podcast with me, Caroline Kay. In this series, we're going to explore some of our best known or even least known Bible stories, helping us reconnect to the West's most important foundational texts. Whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or simply Bible curious, join me to rediscover this outrageous literary collection. As Westerners, it is the air that we breathe and the ground upon which we walk, because these are the stories that literally built the West. They have nurtured, amazed, and sustained us. They have brought us right up to this moment, right here, right now. Welcome to Babel for the Bible curious. Episode 1. Everybody Speaks. Well, what can I say after that introduction but to offer a warm welcome to this new series. We're beginning with the story of the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, 1-9, which is a fascinating story and it's only 9 verses long. We'll explore what it is about and we'll take our exploration beyond the customary ideas about building the tower to reach the heavens and all of the hubris and so on. What if the Tower of Babel isn't so much about a skyscraper or trying to reach God, but more about language, thought, technology and power? We often think of the story as being about a group of people trying to reach the heavens with their tower and God punishing them for their overreach, and that's kind of true, but there's a lot more to it than that. So let's take a deep dive into the Babel story to open up this really rich and complex narrative, and it only happens in 9 verses. At this point, you may be thinking, why start here and not at the beginning of the Bible with the creation stories and Adam and Eve? Well, I'm trying to do something a little bit different. I want to link up stories in ways that are not customarily done. And this is partly because I want to make things strange again, so that we can see these stories in a new way. And there's another reason. This story foregrounds a very important principle that I want to get clear from the outset. I'm claiming that the Bible endorses free speech and thus free thought. So right from the outset, there's a principle established that we are free to think in different ways about the texts that have underpinned our way of life. And this is important, especially as we're often told what to believe about something before we've even started to read that thing. I will also claim that the Bible, through this story, endorses individuality over collectivism. We can even see the beginnings of why the nation state is the best way for us humans to organise ourselves and live in a way that allows us to flourish. In addition to the Bible's take on free speech, freedom and human flourishing, we'll encounter God in sarcastic mode and we'll consider whether or not the people in the story were actually punished or not. Maybe something else is happening. And crucially, we will consider how the story speaks to us today with some surprising conclusions about the way we live, the choices we make, and the danger we are in, especially from technology. Don't worry, we will come back to that. Many commentators have had something to say about this story, scholars, religious, non-religious thinkers alike. So we'll bring all their thoughts into the mix. We're also going to do some book recommendations along the way in this series, and I do look forward to your feedback on that. So, let's begin. The Tower of Babel story, Genesis 11, 1-9, comes after the account of Noah's Ark and just before we meet Abraham. In terms of positioning, the Babel story seems curiously out of place. Why a story about building a tower right after a flood? And why a city after the waters have subsided? In the words of Alice, it is curiouser and curiouser, and yet this little story really is rich with significance. The placing of the story is worth noting, coming as it does straight after Noah and all of that flood, and just before the introduction of a major biblical protagonist, the patriarch Abraham, who becomes Abraham along with his wife Sarai, who becomes Sarah, and of course their progeny, which arguably leads all the way down to us today, here and now. We recall that the flood story concerns everyone in a universally aimed sequence of events where floods have wiped out the worst of humanity, and Noah and his family survive to receive what became known as the Noahide laws. Interestingly, the instruction given to Noah and his family is to repopulate the earth in an echoing of the creation story of Adam and Eve, almost like a second creation story. And we can see how an element of the Tower of Babel story also has a little bit of an echo, and we'll come back to that. Now, Abraham, on the other side of the story, is about one particular nation. And we think of that, of course, as the Israelite nation. So the Babel pericope forms a bridge of sorts between the universal and the particular. And as a little aside, I'll just introduce this word pericope because it's a really handy word to use. A pericope is a specific, self-contained passage or an excerpt from the Bible, and that it's usually in the sense that it forms a single coherent unit of thought or a unit of a certain narrative, a particular story or teaching. And it is actually a Greek word, the Greek word meaning to cut around. So it's a bit like the idea that you're cutting around, you're putting some limits around a particular story to identify it. So it refers to a distinct section, or maybe a particular parable or a miracle story or a set of verses, things that can actually stand alone. And that, of course, is what the Tower of Babel story is. It's something that sits in its own story, if you like. So we call it a pericope. So it's a bit like the word periscope without the S. And it's just a really handy word to use when you're doing biblical studies. Okay, so back to what we're talking about. Okay, so if we take a metaphorical bird's eye view for a moment, the scholar Daniel Gordis has posited that where the creation story demonstrates the Bible's metaphysics, the Garden of Eden demonstrates its theology. Both Cain and Abel and flood stories show us its ethics, and Gordis claims that it's left to the Babel story to present its politics. So this small pericope acts as a foreshadowing of the nation state as a structure that guarantees human freedom and self-realization. So I wouldn't claim that the Bible is saturated with politics, but where it does imply a political idea, it will do so. And the Babel story is one such example. And I think it's a fair example that Gordis is, I think he's right about that. I think it's a fair example to identify. So let's have a look at the story itself. I'm going to use the Judy Klitzner translation because I happen to think it's very interesting. And so we'll have a look at that now. Okay, so, and all the earth was of one language and of one set of words. And as they journeyed from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." And the brick served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and we will make a name for ourselves, lest we scatter over the face of all the earth." And the Lord descended to see the city and the tower that humanity had built. And the Lord said, "If as one nation and one language this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they propose to do will be out of their reach. Come, let us descend and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand each other's language." And the Lord scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore he called its name Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. So that was Judy Klitzner's translation. So we will take a closer look into the way the Hebrew language works, because that's actually quite important in terms of understanding the meaning. And we will return to the actual words of the story as we're going along. The story begins with this description that all the earth had the same language and the same words. So the phrase all the earth, kol haaretz, is biblical code for everyone. So it's basically saying everyone had the same language. Everyone used the same words or spoke the same words. And the phrase all the earth, kol haaretz, actually is mentioned 5 times during this short account. It's only 9 verses, but 5 times you've got this kol haaretz. So it's really making a point here. This is about everyone doing the same, everyone speaking the same. It is significant, and we should take note of that. And so we've got this idea of shared language in addition to the same words. Everyone shares the same language. Now that's significant in itself, and it's probably enough to make the point that everyone can understand one another. And yet we're told about the additional aspect of the same words. So why mention both? So it's important to note, I think, at this stage that the Bible never adds superfluous material, even if we think it does. So we have to draw a conclusion about that, and I think it is a very, very interesting conclusion. And you might be thinking, how can I make that claim about the Bible not adding superfluous material? Well, one of the things that might be more comfortable for the secular types is to think of how these texts have developed and have been honed and redacted and thought about over an awful long period of time. And so you get the opportunity to get it really tight and very tightly honed. And so I think that's exactly what's happened with this story, because structurally it is quite something when you even look at the physical structure of the actual story. But we could come back to some of these ideas, and it doesn't mean that God hasn't influenced it for the religious. Let's just keep an open mind about what's actually going on there. So what the idea of people having the same language and using the same words, what this suggests in pretty strong terms is that everyone spoke and therefore thought in the same way, because we know that thought and speech are very, very closely linked. It's through speech that concepts can be developed. So if language, words, speech, and thought are connected, if you speak and think in the same way, then you probably act in the same way. And that would also suggest that there is little, if any, room for disagreement, because if everyone's thinking the same way, everyone's using the same words, then you're just in a kind of stasis, because it's only by disagreeing and having different thoughts that we can make progress in any real sense. We might want to think about why the situation where everyone's thinking the same way has arisen, and we've got a bit of an answer to that. So the Bible, I would say, is drawing attention to the dangers of the collective, because the word collective always sounds cuddly and nice, the idea of acting together in a little collective. But what happens, the dangerous side of that, is that the individual person becomes less and less important. I think it's fair to say that the Bible spends quite a lot of time stressing the importance of people being made in the image of God and thus to be treated as individuals. Each and every person is important. Each and every person is made in the image of God. This is something that runs right through the Bible. So I suppose at this point, it might be worth addressing this thing about belief, because there might be some people listening to this thinking, well, I don't believe those things. And there are other people thinking, well, this needs to be couched more religiously. So here's a thought. So our world places a lot of emphasis on evidence for things before they're considered to be true. And so that means there are an awful lot of people in the modern world who really struggle with the idea of God because nobody can produce any empirical evidence and say, here he is, there's God. And so this is the subject of big debates between scientists and theologians about the idea of truth. How do we know something is true? What is this thing about truth and so on? So I think it's really important, and I want to do this in the series, is to carve out a space for those who feel, for whatever reason, that they cannot believe, or at least they can't start off with belief at the outset. And so it's also fair to say that there is a big difference between scientific truth and what we might call theological truth. When something is theologically true, it's not the same thing as something being scientifically true. And so this brings us back to the very issue at the heart of the Babel story. You only get to test your ideas when others think differently. So there really is a place for each position, whether you're agnostic, open-minded, atheistic, full-on believer. Everybody's got a different position from which they start. And so this is actually at the heart of the Babel story, because the criticism is really about how everybody is sort of almost kind of like those bricks that are building the tower, identical, instead of being full of character and different and individual. And so another thing for the more secular, possibly agnostic or atheistic types, if you think of God at least as a character in the story. So if you're watching a drama series, you see people playing the parts of characters. And in order to get the film or to get the book you're reading, you have to sort of believe in the characters. At the very, very least, God appears as a character in this story. And if that's where you need to start, then just have that for now. That's fine. God is a character, and he is a bit sarcastic, and he comes down to sort out what he sees as a problem. And I think this is actually the sort of crux, I think, of the story, is this idea of thinking differently. So if people are listening to this podcast and they have varying beliefs, that's actually a really good thing. So the people described in the story, they never get to think differently. How do they get to move forward in their lives? If they're just doing a repetitive task, and let's face it, in ancient times, if you're going to build something that is as tall as the heavens, that's going to be a big project that's going to need a lot of human beings all behaving themselves and working together. And so, you're talking about a colossal project, which kind of makes me feel, is that a kind of, will people have to be enslaved and made to do that? It is a question that's legitimate, I think, in the circumstances. So in the story, we meet a group of apparently well-intentioned people who set out to build a tower with its top in the heavens. Now, here's a thing. Who are these people? Because they're not named. There's no individual named. The people themselves aren't given a group name. It's just anonymous. And that's interesting, because one of the things they say is they want to make a name for themselves. So they want to make a name for themselves. And the idea that this tower is going to be a kind of monument to what? To whom? To them? Why do they want to sort of cluster together and stay in this one place? Well, we can sort of see that that's what they're doing, because the thing that's mentioned first is not the tower. It's the city. So they are building a city, and then they get to build this tower. And I have a feeling that the disquiet that God represents is about the city rather than the actual tower. So one of the threads that will run right through our series, and one of the things that I think we will need to focus on for this particular story, is that we're not really dealing with a set of facts here. The Bible isn't a repository of facts as such. What it's about is meaning. And so this is what we're going to focus on as the series unfolds, as we try and answer some of these questions about what's going on in the story. That really the important thing is what things mean, because there are so many different meanings that people have identified. And it's going to be really hard to point to one and say, well, this is the real meaning, because each meaning has value. Each of the meanings that people have identified has something to teach us or something to think about. So the idea that the Bible is not about a set of facts or, pieces of information, but meaning. And that's a really important thing that we will need to think about. This brings us to our first book recommendation. And I'm going to recommend the book by Peter Enns, How the Bible Actually Works. I think it's a terrific book, very, very easy to read, and it's witty, and it understands, I think, people's difficulties. And so he takes a surprising look at how we can understand Scripture. And his core idea is that the Bible wasn't designed to be a neat little instruction book. It's not a textbook with clear answers to all of our problems. What it is more of a kind of set of ideas. It leads its readers into deeper wisdom. So for him, it's about being a repository of wisdom rather than a repository of easy answers to problems. So it's not an instruction book per se. It's a way of accessing ancient wisdom. I suppose we could put it like that. He tells us that the Bible, of course, we need to be reminded of this all the time, is that even though it has lessons for us today, it is ancient. It really is ancient. But it's also rather ambiguous. So when we talk about the Tower of Babel story having different meanings, many of the stories, many of the parables have different meanings, and that makes for a rather ambiguous set of stories. You haven't necessarily got clear-cut answers. And of course, the other thing is that it's really diverse. It actually talks about lots of different themes. There are many authors involved in composing the Bible over centuries, different cultures, different contexts, and different purposes. So there is no one uniform voice or single correct message. And so, in a sense, we move away from the idea of a Bible as a rule book, but a wisdom book. We say it's actually a book of wisdom. So instead of providing clear-cut, permanent answers to every single question we may have about life, the Bible invites its readers into a journey to discover wisdom. And so lots and lots of real-life stories, real-life situations present themselves, and there are some fairly timeless ideas. There are things that are the same in every generation, in the sense that people get jealous of each other. People have difficulties dealing with material things as opposed to spiritual things. People make mistakes. And so instead of teaching you what to think, it kind of teaches you how to think. And this is something I think is really, really positive. And it's not that it's full of mysteries that you need to solve to locate the real meaning. That it is that the ambiguity, that kind of different possible meanings that come out of a particular story, that's actually deliberate. That's what Enns is suggesting, and I think that's actually quite, it's challenging for some people, but I think that's actually a really positive thing to think about. People find this a bit odd because they get told what things actually mean by clergy, men and women, but sometimes, you've got to actually do a little bit of the work there and engage with it to work out what you think, not because anything goes. I don't think it does that, but it does suggest that life is complex, that it always was complex, it is and always will be complex, and that in order to make wise decisions, you need to engage with a particular situation. And I like his idea that God is not really a helicopter parent. And I've used the phrase with people when I've said God isn't really a puppet master as such. He's not controlling absolutely everything. Certainly not in biblical wisdom. Now, I know some people might take umbrage at that and say, no, actually, God does control everything, but we have free will. And in order to incorporate that into your thoughts about the Bible, you have to think about how that works. So we've got this idea that there are lots of metaphors there, and Enns is at pains to stress that God isn't micromanaging things. Scripture shows us that there are challenges that actually deepen people's maturity and wisdom. So we don't really make progress in life until we've made a few mistakes and learnt from them. And I think the Bible's often telling us stories about that, where people make big mistakes, and then that allows you to sort of experience those things by way of proxy, I suppose. And the thing, I suppose, that's possibly the most important thing is that reading the Bible is something that we do actively. We shouldn't really be passive readers, just being told what things mean, that we should accept that there are different answers to different situations. We are encouraged by Enns to wrestle with the text. Wrestling is something that is actually mentioned when we have Jacob in the Bible. He wrestles with the angel. And we need to understand the context of some of these things. What were the norms of the day, and how can we make sense of those things by translating into the norms of our lives? So it's not that, for example, the one that comes up all the time, of course, is the issue of slavery. It's not that the Bible endorses slavery. There's a lot of evidence that says the Bible doesn't endorse slavery in itself. But slavery was a fact of life at certain points and in certain contexts. So you need to understand that before you pass judgment, I suppose. So the Bible challenges your expectations. So if you go into reading the Bible or encountering the Bible expecting a nice, neat, simple checklist, it won't do that. But what it will do is provoke questions and get you to reflect on life and reflect on the stories that are in there. And wisdom is probably better than certainty. So true biblical wisdom, according to Enns, grows out of life experience, historical awareness, and an honest engagement with ambiguity. That's kind of a challenge for some people, and there are different perspectives, of course. He argues that different voices are actually important, and I think that really does tie in with our exploration of the Tower of Babel. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Sideways Thinker podcast with the Babel series for the Bible curious. Written and produced by me, Caroline Kay. Music is Stars and Laurels by Shane Ivers for Silverman Sounds. If you enjoyed this podcast, and I really hope you did, please like and subscribe and share on the usual platforms. Thank you so much.